Sometimes, destiny doesn't knock. Sometimes, it rings when the wrong person answers. Emily Carter had answered thousands of phone calls during her 4 years as an executive assistant at Hayes Global Technologies, but none of them had ever made the tiny hairs on the back of her neck stand up the way this one did. The late afternoon sun spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive office, painting long golden stripes across the polished hardwood floor as she hurried inside to collect the presentation folders her billionaire boss had forgotten before rushing into another board meeting. Alexander Hayes never forgot anything. At 39, he had built one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity companies in America through discipline that bordered on legendary. His calendar was timed down to the minute. His desk was always immaculate, and every employee knew that if Alexander Hayes promised to be somewhere at exactly 4 p.m., he would arrive at 3:59. That was why the sight of his phone vibrating alone on the corner of his desk immediately felt wrong. The sleek black device lit up again, flashing an incoming call with no name attached, only a private number. Emily hesitated. Company policy was simple: never answer the CEO's personal phone. She reached for it anyway, intending only to silence the ringing before it disturbed the confidential meeting taking place 2 floors below. But just as her fingertips brushed the screen, the call connected by accident. Before she could apologize or hang up, a calm male voice spoke first. "Everything is set. 8:15. He'll never leave the building once the meeting begins." Emily froze. She pulled the phone slightly away from her ear, wondering if she had misunderstood. Her heartbeat became the loudest sound in the silent office. The caller continued without hesitation, convinced he was speaking directly to Alexander. "The board members know nothing. The paperwork will force him into the room, and after that, everything changes. No mistakes this time." Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. She had no idea who this man was, what meeting he meant, or why every instinct inside her suddenly screamed that something was terribly wrong. She quickly ended the call, her fingers trembling just enough to make the phone nearly slip from her hand. The office felt different now. The elegant furniture, the awards lining the shelves, the breathtaking view of downtown Chicago, all of it seemed strangely distant, as though the room itself had stopped breathing. She stared at the phone. Maybe it had been a business negotiation. Maybe she had taken the words out of context. Maybe she was simply exhausted. Exhaustion had become a permanent part of her life. Every morning began before sunrise in her small apartment on the north side of the city. She packed 6-year-old Noah's lunch, drove him to elementary school, fought traffic into downtown Chicago, worked a full day managing impossible schedules, then hurried to her second job preparing bookkeeping reports for a neighborhood bakery after Noah fell asleep. There was never enough money, never enough sleep, but somehow there was always enough love waiting behind her apartment door when Noah wrapped his little arms around her each evening and asked if tomorrow might finally be easier. Emily had learned long ago that ordinary people survive by ignoring things that didn't belong to them. Rich executives had complicated lives. Billion-dollar companies attracted complicated conversations. She should place the phone back on the desk, pretend none of this had happened, and continue organizing tomorrow's calendar. Her hand moved toward the polished walnut desktop, but another detail stopped her cold. Alexander's digital planner lay open beside the phone. The final appointment of the evening had been highlighted in blue. Executive Strategy Session. 8:15 p.m. Executive Conference Room. Emily felt the warmth drain from her face. The exact time. The exact meeting. She looked toward the closed office door as if expecting someone to appear. Outside, employees walked past the glass walls carrying laptops, coffee cups, and cheerful conversations, completely unaware that a single forgotten phone call had just transformed an ordinary Tuesday into something she could neither explain nor ignore. For the first time since joining Hayes Global Technologies, Emily Carter found herself holding something far more valuable than a billionaire's forgotten phone. She was holding a secret she had never been meant to hear. Emily carefully placed Alexander Hayes's phone exactly where she had found it, aligning it with the edge of the walnut desk, as though a perfectly straight line could somehow erase the conversation she had never intended to hear. She stepped backward and forced herself to breathe slowly, but the office suddenly felt too quiet. The steady hum of the building's climate control echoed through the room, while the Chicago skyline shimmered outside beneath the fading afternoon sun. Everything looked ordinary. Everything felt wrong. She gathered the presentation folders against her chest and walked toward the elevator, repeating the caller's words inside her mind. 8:15. He will never leave the building once the meeting begins. The sentence refused to fade no matter how hard she tried to replace it with something practical. Emily had built her entire adult life on practical decisions. At 29 years old, she did not have the luxury of imagining conspiracies or chasing impossible theories. Every paycheck already had a destination before it reached her bank account. Rent, utilities, school supplies, health insurance, groceries. The after-school program that allowed her enough time to finish work before picking up Noah each evening. Every dollar carried responsibility. Every hour belonged to someone else. That was why she had never complained about staying late whenever Alexander's schedule changed unexpectedly. She simply adjusted her own plans, apologized to Noah through a quick phone call, and promised they would eat dinner together a little later. Her son never complained either. 6-year-old Noah possessed the quiet resilience that only children raised by a single parent seem to understand. He celebrated simple things. Pancakes on Saturday mornings. Library visits after school. Watching airplanes disappear into the clouds from the neighborhood park. Whenever Emily apologized for working too much, Noah always smiled and answered with the same words. "You always come back, Mom." Those words carried her through days when exhaustion felt heavier than hope. As the elevator descended toward the executive floor lobby, Emily caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. Loose strands of chestnut hair had escaped her ponytail. Dark circles rested beneath tired blue eyes. Her navy blazer looked slightly wrinkled after another 12-hour day. She looked nothing like the confident professionals featured on the company's promotional brochures. She looked like a mother trying very hard not to fall behind. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Employees crossed the marble lobby carrying laptop bags and discussing dinner reservations, client presentations, and weekend plans. Their conversations blended into harmless background noise while Emily searched the crowd for Alexander. She spotted him near the reception area surrounded by board members. As always, he stood with calm confidence, listening more than speaking. His charcoal suit remained perfectly pressed despite the long day, and his composed expression revealed nothing about the pressure of leading a multi-billion-dollar company. People often described Alexander Hayes as intimidating. Emily had always disagreed. Reserved, yes. Demanding, certainly. But never unfair. During the 4 years she had worked beside him, she had watched him remember employees' birthdays, quietly pay medical expenses for a retiring security guard, and personally thank the overnight maintenance staff every Christmas before anyone else arrived. He rarely spoke about kindness, but he practiced it with remarkable consistency. That made the mysterious phone call even harder to dismiss. Someone had spoken about him as though he were simply another obstacle standing in the way of an unknown plan. Emily tightened her grip on the folders. She considered walking directly toward him and repeating every word she had heard. Yet another voice interrupted her thoughts. Human Resources Director Melissa Grant approached with a welcoming smile. "Emily, Alexander has already gone upstairs for a private strategy discussion. He asked me to remind you that tomorrow begins at 7:30 instead of 8. Emily forced a polite smile. "Thank you. I will be ready." Melissa continued down the hallway without noticing the concern on Emily's face. Upstairs, another private meeting, another carefully arranged schedule. Emily glanced toward the executive elevators reserved for senior leadership. A digital clock mounted above the reception desk quietly changed to 5:38. Less than 3 hours remained until 8:15. She told herself once more that there had to be an innocent explanation, but the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. For the first time in years, doing nothing no longer felt like the responsible choice. It felt like the beginning of a mistake she might never forgive herself for making. Emily remained near the reception desk long after most employees had returned to their offices, pretending to organize tomorrow's meeting packets while her thoughts circled the same unanswered question. If she stayed silent and nothing happened, she would only lose a little sleep. But if she stayed silent and the strange caller had been telling the truth, she would spend the rest of her life wondering whether one conversation could have changed everything. She finally made up her mind. She picked up Alexander Hayes' spare tablet from the executive assistant station and quietly headed toward the private conference level, hoping only to catch him between meetings for a brief conversation. The executive hallway was unusually quiet. Soft recessed lighting reflected across the marble floor, and the distant sound of rain tapping against the glass curtain walls replaced the busy conversations that usually filled the building before closing time. As Emily approached the security doors, she noticed two senior executives leaving the restricted conference room. One of them was Richard Donovan, the company's chief financial officer, a man respected by shareholders for his brilliant numbers and admired by employees for his polished manners. The other was Martin Cole, the vice president of corporate strategy. Both men smiled politely as they walked past her, but neither slowed down. Emily offered a courteous nod before continuing toward Alexander's office suite. Just as she reached for the door handle, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Emily. She turned to see Martin Cole walking back toward her with an easy smile that somehow failed to reach his eyes. I thought everyone on this floor had already gone home. Emily lifted the folders slightly. Mr. Hayes asked for tomorrow's briefing materials to be updated. Martin glanced toward the tablet in her hand before looking back at her. You work harder than anyone around here. His voice sounded friendly enough, yet something about the conversation felt strangely deliberate. Did Alexander leave his office recently? Emily answered honestly. I believe he is still in meetings. Martin nodded slowly. Good. If you happen to see his personal phone, let me know. I have been trying to reach him for almost an hour. Emily felt a quiet chill spread through her chest. She remembered the unknown caller. She remembered the exact time. She forced herself to remain calm. I have not seen it recently. Martin smiled again, thanked her, and walked away without another word. Emily waited until his footsteps disappeared before exhaling. It might have been a perfectly innocent question, yet every instinct inside her whispered that something no longer fit together the way it should. She entered Alexander's outer office and placed the updated folders neatly on his desk. The forgotten phone was gone. Someone had already returned it to him. For a brief moment, relief washed over her. Perhaps she had worried for nothing. Then she noticed something else. A printed schedule lay beside his laptop with several handwritten notes in blue ink. Every appointment matched the digital calendar except one. The executive strategy session had originally been scheduled for conference room 7 on the 34th floor. Someone had crossed it out and rewritten conference room 12 on the 36th floor. The change had not been announced to the administrative staff. Emily stared at the page. Why would such an important meeting move only a few hours beforehand without notifying the assistants responsible for preparing it? Before she could think further, another voice interrupted the silence. You should not be in here alone. Emily turned quickly. It was Charles Bennett, the company's longtime head of building security. Unlike most executives, Charles carried himself with quiet humility earned from decades of service. I am sorry, Emily said. I was only dropping off tomorrow's files. Charles smiled kindly. I know. You always do everything by the book. He looked around the office for a moment before lowering his voice. Tonight is going to be unusually busy upstairs. Several outside consultants arrived earlier than expected. Security access has been tightened for everyone. Emily hesitated. Has that ever happened before? Charles thought for a moment. Not that I can remember. He tipped his head politely and continued down the hallway. Emily remained standing beside Alexander's desk, listening to the soft ticking of the elegant clock mounted on the wall. Outside, the evening sky had turned a deep slate gray as rain streaked across the windows overlooking the city. She checked the time on her watch. 7:23. Less than 1 hour remained. One forgotten phone call. One unexplained schedule change. One executive asking unusual questions. None of those details proved anything on their own. Together, however, they formed a pattern that Emily could no longer dismiss as coincidence. For the first time since she joined Hayes Global Technologies, she realized that loyalty was not simply following instructions. Sometimes loyalty meant finding the courage to speak before it was too late. Emily looked once more at the handwritten change on Alexander Hayes' schedule before quietly stepping out of his office. The hallway seemed even quieter than before, as though the entire executive floor had begun holding its breath. The digital clock near the elevators changed to 7:28. Every passing minute tightened the knot in her stomach. She reached for her phone, opened a blank message addressed to Alexander, and stared at the empty screen. How could she possibly explain what she had heard without sounding irrational? A mysterious phone call. An unfamiliar voice. A sentence with no names, no evidence, and no proof. She deleted the message before typing a single word. If she was going to interrupt the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar company, she needed more than a feeling. She needed to tell him face to face. Emily hurried toward the executive conference level. The private reception area outside conference room 12 was already busy with assistants delivering documents, members of the legal department reviewing contracts, and technical staff preparing presentation equipment. Through the glass walls, she caught a glimpse of Alexander speaking with several board members. Even from a distance, he appeared completely composed, listening carefully while occasionally nodding. His calm presence somehow made everyone around him lower their voices. Emily waited patiently beside the reception desk, hoping the meeting would pause for even a moment. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Every time she thought Alexander might step outside, another executive approached him with another folder or another question. Finally, the conference room doors opened. Several board members exited briefly for coffee before the evening session officially began. Emily saw her opportunity. "Mr. Hayes." Alexander turned immediately. "Emily, I thought you had gone home." His expression softened slightly with genuine concern. "Is Noah all right?" Even under pressure, he still remembered her son's name. Emily swallowed. "Yes, sir. Noah is fine. I need to tell you something privately." "It cannot wait." Alexander studied her face for several seconds. During 4 years of working together, he had rarely seen her visibly unsettled. "Walk with me." He led her into a smaller consultation room beside the main conference hall and quietly closed the door behind them. The room was simple. A round table, 2 chairs, a wall-mounted screen displaying tomorrow's financial projections. Rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Alexander loosened his tie slightly and folded his hands. "Tell me what happened." Emily took a slow breath. "This afternoon you left your phone in your office." He nodded once. "I realized that after the board meeting. It rang while I was collecting your presentation folders. I did not mean to answer it, but the call connected accidentally." Alexander remained silent, allowing her to continue without interruption. "The caller believed he was speaking to you. He said everything was ready. He mentioned tonight. He specifically said that once your meeting began at 8:15, you would never leave the building." The room became completely still. Alexander's expression did not change immediately. Instead, he calmly asked, "Did the caller identify himself?" "No." "Did you recognize the voice?" "No, sir." "Anything else?" Emily repeated every sentence exactly as she remembered it, careful not to exaggerate or guess. When she finished, Alexander leaned back thoughtfully. He did not dismiss her. He did not laugh. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and placed his phone on the table. Opening the recent call history, he frowned. The unknown number was gone. "That is strange," he murmured quietly. Emily looked at the screen. "It disappeared?" "Every incoming call is normally recorded automatically." Alexander scrolled through the log again before locking the phone. "There is no record of what you described." Emily lowered her eyes. "I understand how this sounds. I almost convinced myself I imagined it." Alexander stood and walked toward the rain-covered window. Downtown Chicago glowed beneath thousands of lights beginning to reflect across the wet streets below. After several silent moments, he spoke without turning around. "You have worked beside me for 4 years. You have never exaggerated a report, never invented a problem, and never asked for attention. I trust your honesty." Emily looked up, surprised. Alexander finally faced her again. "Whether this call was a misunderstanding or something more serious, I cannot ignore it." He picked up his tablet and opened the evening schedule. His eyes stopped on one line. Executive Strategy Session. 8:15. Conference Room 12. Then his expression changed almost imperceptibly as he noticed another detail. "Interesting." Emily followed his gaze. Alexander enlarged the calendar history. The room assignment had been changed only 42 minutes earlier using executive authorization that should have required his personal approval. He had never approved it. Alexander looked at the calendar history one more time before locking the screen. His expression remained calm, but Emily noticed something she had never seen before. He was no longer looking at the schedule. He was studying the pattern behind it. "Only 3 people have authorization to change executive meetings without my approval," he said quietly. "Myself, Richard Donovan, and our Chief Information Officer." Emily remembered passing Richard in the hallway less than an hour earlier. She hesitated before speaking. Mr. Donovan asked whether I had seen your phone. Alexander slowly turned toward her. Did he? She nodded. He said he had been trying to reach you. Alexander folded his arms, thoughtful rather than alarmed. Richard has worked beside me for 9 years. If there is an explanation, I want facts before conclusions. Emily appreciated that answer. It sounded exactly like the leader she had worked for all these years. He never judged first. He investigated first. The digital clock on the conference room wall quietly shifted to 7:48. Less than 30 minutes remained before the strategy session. Alexander reached for another device stored inside the cabinet beneath the screen. It was a secure company tablet connected to the internal network, but isolated from his personal accounts. If someone removed the call history from my phone, he said, they could not erase the activity logs from the communications server. His fingers moved quickly across the screen while Emily watched in silence. Rows of encrypted records appeared one after another. Incoming calls, internal transfers, authentication requests. Most looked meaningless to her until Alexander suddenly stopped scrolling. His eyes narrowed. There it is. Emily stepped closer. An incoming connection from a blocked private relay had reached his phone at 4:17 that afternoon. The duration showed only 4 seconds before the record ended abruptly. For seconds, Emily whispered. We spoke much longer than that. Alexander nodded, which means someone interrupted the logging process after the connection was established. He looked at her. That requires administrative access. A quiet knock interrupted them. Both turned toward the door. Charles Bennett entered with his usual composed expression. I apologize for disturbing you, sir. Security requested your confirmation regarding tonight's guest access list. Alexander accepted the tablet Charles handed him, but did not immediately sign it. Instead, he asked a simple question. Charles, has anyone requested unusual access to conference room 12 this evening? Charles thought for a moment. Actually, yes. About an hour ago, facilities received an urgent request to replace the presentation system before your meeting. The request carried executive authorization, so my team approved the technicians. Alexander exchanged a quick glance with Emily. Which executive approved it? Charles checked the digital record. His forehead creased slightly. That is odd. The authorization field has already been deleted. Silence settled across the room. Charles looked from Alexander to Emily, immediately recognizing the seriousness in both faces. Is there a problem? Alexander answered carefully. Not yet, but I would like your assistance. Within minutes, the three of them stood inside the security operations room overlooking dozens of live camera feeds from every floor of Hayes Global Technologies. Rain continued falling outside while monitors displayed elevators, hallways, conference rooms, and loading docks. Charles enlarged the footage covering the executive corridor during the previous hour. Employees appeared and disappeared across the screen, carrying laptops and coffee cups. Then Emily pointed toward one monitor. Stop. Charles paused the recording. Richard Donovan appeared outside conference room 12 speaking briefly with 2 men wearing contractor uniforms. They carried large equipment cases labeled audio-visual services. Nothing about them seemed unusual until the video advanced another few seconds. Instead of entering the conference room immediately, one of the contractors quietly handed Richard a sealed envelope. Richard slipped it inside his briefcase before continuing down the hallway without looking back. Alexander remained silent for several moments. Finally, he spoke. Zoom in on the company logo. Charles enlarged the image on the equipment case. Emily leaned closer. The printed logo looked slightly blurred. One letter in the company name had been misspelled. Charles frowned. That is not one of our approved vendors. Alexander's voice remained steady, but every word carried new weight. Then someone entered this building tonight using false credentials. Emily felt her pulse quicken as the security room suddenly seemed much smaller than before. The mysterious phone call, the missing records, the altered meeting location, the erased authorization, the unfamiliar contractors. Separate pieces that had made no sense on their own were beginning to fit together into a single picture. Alexander looked at the digital clock above the monitors. 8 o'clock. Exactly 15 minutes remained before dozens of executives would gather inside conference room 12, believing they were attending nothing more than another routine strategy meeting. Alexander looked around the security operations room with the same calm focus that had guided his company through financial crises, cyber attacks, and impossible deadlines. But Emily could tell something had changed. This was no longer simply a business problem. Someone had deliberately manipulated internal systems, altered executive schedules, and entered the building under false credentials. The question was no longer whether something unusual was happening. The question was what would happen at exactly 8:15. Charles Bennett immediately contacted two trusted supervisors through the encrypted security network, carefully instructing them to verify every contractor inside the building without causing unnecessary attention. Alexander stopped him before he sent another message. "No building-wide alerts," he said quietly. "If someone inside is coordinating this, I do not want them realizing we know." Charles nodded in agreement. Years of experience had taught him that calm decisions usually produced the safest outcomes. Emily stood silently beside the wall of surveillance monitors, watching employees continue their evening routines completely unaware that an invisible race against time had already begun. Board members chatted in the executive lounge. Catering staff arranged coffee and bottled water outside conference room 12. Lawyers reviewed thick contract binders. It looked exactly like every important meeting Hayes Global Technologies had ever hosted. That was precisely what made it so unsettling. Alexander opened the secure communications panel and sent a brief message to his executive assistant team. Due to a scheduling adjustment, all board members are requested to gather temporarily in conference room 9 for updated briefing materials. Thank you for your flexibility. Emily looked at him in surprise. There are no briefing materials in conference room 9. Alexander gave a faint smile. There will be in about 2 minutes. He handed her a folder from the nearby printer. Would you help me buy some time? She accepted it immediately. Of course. Together, they walked quickly through the executive hallway while Charles quietly redirected security personnel toward the 36th floor. Employees responded naturally to the revised instructions, assuming another last-minute change had been made by the chief executive officer. Within minutes, the flow of people shifted away from conference room 12 and toward the neighboring room instead. No one questioned the adjustment. At Hayes Global Technologies, Alexander Hayes was known for changing meeting agendas moments before they began. Emily felt a small wave of relief as she watched directors and board members disappear through the doors of conference room 9. At least they were no longer gathering where they had originally been instructed. As she turned back toward the hallway, she noticed two maintenance workers rolling the same large equipment cases toward conference room 12. Their uniforms looked identical to those she had seen on the security footage. One of them glanced briefly toward the crowd before lowering his cap. Emily's heart skipped. She quietly touched Alexander's sleeve. Those are the same men. Alexander followed her gaze without making any sudden movement. Charles, he spoke softly into the small communication device hidden beneath his jacket. Caller. The contractors have arrived. Charles answered almost instantly. Understood. My team is already moving into position. The contractors unlocked the conference room and disappeared inside with their equipment. Several seconds passed. Then another. Alexander remained perfectly still. We wait, he said calmly. Emily struggled to understand how he could remain so composed. Every instinct told her to run after them or call the police immediately. Yet Alexander seemed to be calculating every possible consequence before taking a single step. Less than 5 minutes remained until the scheduled meeting. Suddenly, Charles's voice returned through the communication channel. Sir, we have confirmed the vendor company. They have no employees working in this building tonight. The identification badges used by those contractors belong to 2 technicians currently attending a conference in Denver. Emily felt the color drain from her face. The men inside conference room 12 had entered the building using stolen identities. Before anyone could respond, another message arrived from one of Charles's supervisors. The room has been checked from outside. No one is answering. The door appears to be locked from the inside. Alexander's expression hardened for the first time that evening, not with anger, but with certainty. He looked directly at Charles through the nearest security camera mounted above the hallway. Use the master override. Within seconds, a quiet electronic click echoed through the corridor as the security system released the electronic lock protecting conference room 12. Alexander reached the door first, with Emily and Charles only a step behind him. He slowly pushed it open. The spacious conference room stood completely empty. The polished table, leather chairs, projection screens, and neatly arranged bottled water looked untouched. The two contractors had vanished. Their equipment cases remained behind, closed and unattended near the presentation podium. Alexander walked forward cautiously until he noticed a folded sheet of white paper resting alone in the center of the conference table. There was no signature, only one sentence printed neatly. Across the page, the meeting was never the real target. Thank you for moving everyone exactly where we wanted them to be. Emily read the single sentence again, hoping she had misunderstood it the first time. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers, not because of fear alone, but because every assumption they had made during the past hours suddenly collapsed into something far more complicated. Alexander gently took the page and studied the precise lettering without saying a word. His expression remained remarkably steady, yet Emily noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. Whoever had planned this had expected them to react exactly as they had. The mysterious phone call, the altered meeting location, the fake contractors, even the abandoned equipment cases had been carefully arranged to guide every decision they made. Charles immediately ordered his security supervisors to secure both conference rooms while discreetly escorting every board member back to the executive lounge. There was no panic, no raised voices, only calm instructions delivered with practiced professionalism. Within minutes, the executives believed another technical issue had delayed the meeting. None of them realized they had unknowingly become part of a much larger deception. Alexander slowly walked toward one of the unopened equipment cases and carefully examined its exterior without touching the latches. Call the city police liaison, he told Charles. Also request our digital forensics team. I want these cases documented exactly as they were found. Charles nodded and stepped outside to coordinate the response. Silence returned to the conference room. Rain continued tapping softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows while downtown Chicago shimmered beneath thousands of reflected lights. Emily stood beside the conference table, still trying to understand why someone would go through such extraordinary effort only to leave behind a message. Alexander finally looked at her. You changed tonight. Emily blinked. Sir, most people would have ignored that phone call. He folded the paper neatly and placed it inside a document sleeve. You chose responsibility instead of convenience. Emily lowered her eyes. I almost ignored it. Alexander offered a faint smile. But you did not. Before either of them could say more, Charles returned carrying a tablet. Sir, we have something. He displayed security footage from the loading dock recorded less than 20 minutes earlier. The two fake contractors appeared pushing empty equipment carts toward a white delivery van parked behind the building. Their faces remained partially hidden beneath baseball caps, but one unexpected detail caught Emily's attention. Richard Donovan stood several yards away speaking on his phone. He never approached the men. He never handed them anything. In fact, after a brief glance toward the loading dock, he walked in the opposite direction and entered his own vehicle. Emily looked at Alexander. Then he was not working with them. Alexander nodded slowly. Or at least there is no evidence that he was. Emily felt a wave of relief mixed with embarrassment. She had quietly suspected a man based almost entirely on coincidence. Alexander noticed the change in her expression. This is why facts matter more than assumptions. His voice carried no criticism, only a quiet lesson. Charles enlarged another camera angle. A third person briefly appeared near the delivery van wearing an ordinary gray raincoat and carrying a messenger bag. Unlike the contractors, this individual kept his face completely turned away from every camera before stepping into another waiting vehicle that immediately disappeared into evening traffic. Can we identify that car? Alexander asked. Charles shook his head. The license plate is blocked by another vehicle at exactly the wrong moment. Emily stared at the screen. Whoever had organized this operation seemed to understand every security camera, every blind angle, every routine inside the building. It was as though they had studied Hayes Global Technologies for months. A notification suddenly appeared on Alexander's secure phone. One unread email. No sender name. No subject line. Only a single attachment labeled README. Charles immediately reached for the device. Please do not open it yet. Our cybersecurity team should examine it first. Alexander agreed without hesitation and handed over the phone. Minutes later, the head of digital forensics arrived carrying an isolated analysis laptop. The attachment was copied into the protected system and opened safely. There was no malicious software, no demand, no threats, only a short typed message. Mr. Hayes, tonight was never about harming people. It was about proving how easily trusted systems can be manipulated when trusted people stop asking questions. One person inside your company refused to ignore what felt wrong. She changed everything. The room fell completely silent. Emily felt every eye turned toward her. She wished they had not. She had never wanted recognition. She had only wanted to prevent something she could not fully understand. Alexander quietly folded his arms before looking directly at her with unmistakable respect. "Emily," he said softly, "if you had dismissed that call as someone else's problem, every weakness inside this company would have remained invisible. Tonight you may have protected far more than you realize." The following morning, sunlight poured through the glass walls of Hayes Global Technologies as though the previous night's uncertainty had never existed. Employees arrived carrying coffee cups, greeting one another with familiar smiles, completely unaware that the company's leadership had spent most of the night reviewing security records, communication logs, and internal procedures. Emily Carter stepped out of the elevator a few minutes before 7:30, just as she always did. Her navy blazer had been carefully pressed before sunrise, and she carried the same leather notebook she had used every workday for the past 4 years. To everyone else, it looked like another ordinary Wednesday. Only she knew how different everything felt. She quietly placed fresh briefing folders on Alexander Hayes's desk before organizing the morning calendar exactly as she had done hundreds of times before. Familiar routines had always helped calm her thoughts. Yet today they only reminded her how close she had come to dismissing one unexpected phone call. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. "Mr. Hayes would like to see you when you have a moment," the receptionist said with an encouraging smile. Emily felt a small wave of nervousness as she walked toward the executive office. Alexander stood beside the window overlooking downtown Chicago, watching the morning traffic flow beneath the rising sun. He turned as she entered. "Good morning, Emily." "Good morning, sir." He motioned toward a chair across from his desk. "Please sit down." Emily obeyed, unsure what to expect. Alexander placed a slim folder on the polished walnut surface between them. "Our cybersecurity team completed its preliminary review before sunrise. The message we received last night originated from an independent ethical security group." Emily looked up in surprise. "It was a test?" Alexander nodded slowly. "An unauthorized one. They were attempting to demonstrate weaknesses in executive communication, identity verification, and emergency decision-making. They crossed legal and professional boundaries, and our attorneys are already addressing that. However," he paused briefly before continuing, "their findings exposed vulnerabilities we should have identified ourselves." Emily remained silent. Alexander rarely wasted words. When he paused, it usually meant what followed mattered. The report contained one observation repeated several times. He opened the folder and slid a single page toward her. One sentence had been highlighted. The strongest security system in the building was not software. It was one employee willing to question something that did not feel right. Emily stared quietly at the words. "They were talking about you," Alexander said. "I was only doing what seemed responsible." "No," he replied gently. "Many people notice unusual things every day. Very few decide they are worth acting on." He closed the folder before reaching for another document. "Last night, I asked Human Resources to prepare something." Emily accepted the envelope he handed her. Inside was a formal letter signed personally by Alexander. Effective immediately, Emily Carter was being appointed Director of Executive Operations and Risk Coordination, a newly created position responsible for strengthening communication between executive leadership, administration, and corporate security. Her salary reflected the increased responsibility, along with expanded benefits that included educational funding and family support services. Emily read the first paragraph twice before looking back up. "Sir, I have never asked for a promotion." Alexander smiled faintly. "That is one reason you deserve it." Emotion caught unexpectedly in Emily's throat. For years, she had measured success one grocery receipt at a time, one utility bill at a time, one school expense at a time. She had never imagined a single decision could alter the direction of her career so completely. Alexander walked around the desk instead of remaining behind it. "There is one more thing." He handed her another small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. It contained only a short sentence. Thank you for reminding me that trust is built by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. There was no corporate logo, no signature beyond his name written simply as Alexander. Emily folded the note carefully and placed it inside her notebook beside a photograph of Noah smiling at last summer's county fair. She realized those two pieces of paper represented the same truth in different ways. One reminded her why she worked so hard every day. The other reminded her that integrity rarely announces itself with applause. As she stood to leave, Alexander spoke one final time. This weekend, if you and Noah are free, there is a family open house at our innovation center. I think he might enjoy the robotics exhibit. Emily smiled for the first time since the forgotten phone had changed everything. He would love that. Alexander nodded warmly. Then I look forward to meeting the young man who reminds his mother every day to keep coming home. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Hayes Global Technologies felt noticeably different. New identity verification procedures had been introduced without disrupting the company's welcoming culture. Executive assistants now participated in security briefings alongside department leaders. Building access requests required additional confirmation. Instead of treating caution as inconvenience, employees began treating it as respect for one another. Alexander Hayes insisted that every improvement remain focused on trust rather than fear. The goal is not to make people suspicious, he told the leadership team during the monthly meeting. The goal is to make integrity easier to recognize. Emily Carter listened from her new seat near the front of the conference room. Even after receiving her promotion, she still arrived before sunrise, organized every meeting with the same attention to detail, and greeted every employee by name whenever she could. Titles had changed. Her character had not. On Saturday morning, bright autumn sunshine filled the Hayes Innovation Center as dozens of families explored robotics demonstrations, engineering exhibits, and interactive technology displays. Children laughed while small robots navigated colorful obstacle courses across polished floors. Parents snapped photographs beside prototype electric vehicles and virtual reality displays. Emily watched Noah race excitedly toward a robot that could stack wooden blocks faster than any human hand. His blue eyes sparkled with amazement. "Mom, did you know computers could do that?" Emily laughed. "Not until today." A familiar voice answered behind them. "The robot is impressive, but I still think curiosity is the greatest invention." Noah turned to see Alexander approaching without his usual business suit. Wearing dark jeans, a light blue button-down shirt, and comfortable sneakers, he looked less like one of America's most respected chief executive officers and more like an ordinary neighbor enjoying a weekend with friends. Noah smiled politely. "Are you Mr. Hayes?" Alexander knelt until they were nearly eye level. "I am. You must be Noah." The little boy nodded proudly. "Mom says you work really hard." Alexander glanced toward Emily before smiling again. "Your mother works even harder." Noah thought about that answer for a moment before reaching into his backpack. He carefully pulled out a small drawing folded in half. "I made this for you." Alexander accepted the paper with genuine surprise. Inside was a simple picture drawn with colored pencils. 3 stick figures stood in front of a tall glass building. Beneath a bright yellow sun, one figure held a phone. Another wore a blue tie. The smallest figure stood between them smiling. Across the top, written in careful first-grade handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being kind to my mom." Alexander remained silent for several seconds, studying the drawing as though it were worth far more than any artwork hanging in his executive office. "This is one of the nicest gifts I have ever received," he said softly. Noah grinned. "Mom says good people help other people even when nobody is watching." Alexander looked toward Emily, who suddenly recognized those words. She had told Noah that years earlier after returning a lost wallet she could barely afford not to keep. She had forgotten the conversation completely. Noah had not. Alexander folded the drawing carefully instead of slipping it into his pocket. "Would it be all right if I framed this in my office?" Noah's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" Emily watched the exchange with quiet gratitude. Wealth had never impressed her. Kindness always had. As the afternoon came to an end, families slowly made their way toward the parking lot beneath a sky painted with warm shades of gold and orange. Noah climbed into the back seat of their aging sedan, already talking excitedly about robots, engineers, and inventions he wanted to build one day. Emily closed the driver's door before looking once more toward the entrance of the Innovation Center. Alexander stood near the doorway speaking with employees and their families, treating every conversation with the same patience and respect. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the parking lot. Neither of them waved. Neither of them needed to. Some moments spoke more clearly through quiet understanding than words ever could. As Emily started the engine, she glanced at the small handwritten note Alexander had given her, still tucked safely inside her notebook beside Noah's photograph. She smiled, then drove toward home where dinner, homework, and another ordinary evening waited. Because in the end, life is rarely changed by the loudest moments. More often, it changes when an ordinary person chooses to answer one unexpected call, refuses to ignore a quiet voice inside, and reminds everyone around them that the strongest foundation any future can stand upon will always be simple human kindness.